Hey there, this is Joey from EDHREC, and today I've got some data for you. So as we all know, the Game Changers list was recently expanded. Some cards were even unbanned and added to the Game Changers list too. Everyone and their mother has been making videos about it, including us. In this video, I'd like to share some really cool behind-the-scenes data with you about the new Game Changers. How many players are running on average in their commander decks, which brackets players are falling into the most often, and whether the new Game Changers list is actually lining up with the ways that players are defining their own deck lists. And I also want to ask the question of whether the expansion of the Game Changers has been overall a good move, or has it gone too far? We shared a little bit of this data in our most recent podcast episode, and certainly go check that video out. It was a really fun conversation, but the data was a very brief part of that conversation, and we got some comments requesting a more expanded video about all of that information, so that's what you're watching now. Plus, at the end of this video, there's some extra data that we didn't have back when we recorded that other episode, so there's even more information in this one, so I'm excited to get into it. Let's dig in. First, let me establish the old data. When we had the original list of 40 Game Changers, we saw this breakdown. Broadly speaking, about 52% of decks contained 0 Game Changers, a full third of decks contained 1 to 3 Game Changers, and 15% contained 4 or more. This graph is obviously tracking the information over many years, so I've simplified it into this pie chart here, which shows the data that we care about for decks today. To again reiterate, that's 52% with no Game Changers, 33% with 1, 2, or 3 of them, and 15% with 4 or more Game Changers. Now, if a deck contains 4 or more Game Changers, we know for sure that it is a bracket 4 or 5, but of course, a deck containing 0 Game Changers does not mean it is definitely a bracket 1 or 2, so we should not look at that 52% figure as though these are definitely Exhibition and Core bracket 1 and 2 decks. You can totally build extraordinarily optimized decks that belong in bracket 4 or whatever without any Game Changers being present. As has been hammered home by all who are discussing this subject, your intentions are what matter here. Game Changers are just a signal flare of your deck's intent, but your deck's intent is the priority. That's why we compared this set of data to another set of data. We checked it against the ways that players are self-reporting the brackets of their decks. We got information from Archidekt showing a breakdown of how users are declaring their own brackets. Archidekt does have a very handy and sophisticated feature that helps estimate your deck bracket based off of the presence of things like Game Changers or infinite combos in the list. But to be clear, the data that we're discussing right now does not include any estimates. We're not talking about approximations. We're talking specifically about decks where the user declared the bracket themselves. And of course, Archidekt verified that too. If a user labeled their deck as a bracket 2, but then their deck contains 5 Game Changers in it, that's a little fishy. That seems like a bit of a misrepresentation, so that type of thing is not counted in this data. The data that we have here are numbers where the user declared it themselves, and by available metrics, it does not appear to be a misrepresentation. And here's what we found. In the data, we saw that 5% of users' decks were labeled at bracket 1, Exhibition, 28% at bracket 2, Core, 42% were at bracket 3, Upgraded, almost 20% at bracket 4, Optimized, and there were 4% at bracket 5, EDH. Again, this data is how users reported their own decks with the original understanding of the brackets in the original list of 40 Game Changers. So let's get this graph side by side with the previous one. As I'm sure you noticed immediately, these graphs don't match up very well. 24% of decks are reporting at bracket 4 or 5, and yet only 15% of decks contain 4 or more Game Changers. More than half of decks contain 0 Game Changers at all, and yet well under half of players are reporting playing at brackets 1 and 2. We've said it on a previous show, but I'll say it again here. One of the biggest takeaways of the differences between these datasets is that it reflects that players were reporting their decks upward. Even though they didn't have any Game Changers in their decks, a huge chunk of players were still like, yeah, but this deck ain't a 2. Even though only 15% of decks contain 4 or more Game Changers, 24% of the decks we're seeing here were clearly moments where the brewer looked at their deck and said, well, yeah, but this is still a bracket 4 or 5 though. Players took it upon themselves to report their decks in those areas, even despite not having as many specific Game Changer clues to signal that their deck ought to fall in those areas. High key, that shit makes me really proud to be a Magic player. I love that. And you know what? If you're also loving what you're seeing, consider subscribing. We do fun behind the scenes data stuff like this all the time. So like, subscribe, hit that bell so that you don't miss out on cool data dives like this. And in fact, here's actually a bonus piece of data for you. Did you know that only half of folks who watch the channel on the regular are actually subscribed? That's wild. Give it a chance. We have fun over here. Now, of course, there are some biases for us to observe in the data here. For one thing, we're measuring responses from players who are online enough and familiar with the system enough to select their brackets on their already online deck lists. That is not necessarily reflective of the average player or average experience out there. Also, this is user-reported data from only one website, whereas the EDHREC data is drawing from many websites. So we have to be aware of what's happening there with some very different sample sizes. I'm working with what I've got, but that is a factor to address. Real quick though, while I'm talking about biases, I just want to dispel one thing that a lot of folks still worry could be an issue, and it's that EDHREC doesn't count duplicate deck lists, or even decks that are too close to an average precon. We safeguard against things like spam lists and such too, like that, just so that a lot of these things don't gum up the data or bog a commander's page down too much, or influence the numbers like the numbers that we're trying to discuss in this video. There are flaws in EDHREC's data, obviously. That is the premise of the channel. That's what we like to interrogate on the EDHREC podcast. That's why we have Challenge to Stats as a regular segment on the podcast. There's a lot to critique and to be aware of, but I just wanted to take a moment to dispel that particular worry because I'd seen it cropping a lot in online discussion again. All right, so that was all of the old data from the original list of 40 game changers, but now that we have 61 game changers, what does all the data look like now? Here we have our new game changer distribution, and the numbers are way different. Now that there are several more game changers out there pinging up in players' deck lists, we now see that 41% of decks contain 0 game changers, a combined 38% contain 1 to 3 game changers, and that leaves 21% of decks that contain 4 or more of them. And like a quick side-by-side comparison of this chart versus the last one, those are some big shifts. Since right now we don't care so much about the data across past years, let's simplify back to the pie charts again to best observe the differences in the data today. 52% versus 41, 33% versus 38, 15% versus 21. Very big changes. But more importantly, let's compare this new distribution data against the previous pie chart of how players were self-declaring their deck lists. Before, we saw big discrepancies between the two, but now the data lines up way better. Previously, we saw that 24% of decks were reported as a bracket 4 or 5, and yet only 15% of decks contained 4+ game changers. But now we see that 21% of decks contain 4+ game changers, and that means the figures line up so much closer. Those numbers are finally in the same ballpark as each other. Or 42% of decks are getting declared by their pilot as bracket 3, when previously only 33% of decks were showing as containing 1 to 3 game changers, but now 38% of them are showing as containing that number. Hell yeah, that feels like such a better alignment. To cut right to the point, this is why I was in favor of expanding the game changers list in the first place. Player expectation should at least roughly hew close to the numbers, right? And it wasn't doing that before. It's not an exact 1-to-1 match or anything, of course, but it doesn't need to be. We don't need to keep tweaking with the list until they match exactly on each figure. That would be really tedious. Having some wiggle room is really good because this is still an imprecise and blossoming system. Like, these parts of the pie charts line up really nicely with each other, but the biggest discrepancy that still exists is, of course, in the 0 game changer and bracket 1 to 2 areas, because roughly 33% of decks were being reported as bracket 1 to 2, and yet 41% of decks across the entire EDHREC database contain no game changers. That's still a sizable gap. But A, that number was a whopping 52% beforehand, and B, you can still build bracket 3+ decks even without any game changers in them. This new figure here, I think, allows for that space without it feeling like an enormous leap, which is how it kind of felt before. Plus, I anticipate more cards becoming unbanned in the future, and those cards, just like the 5 very recent unbans, would then fall onto the game changers list. And it's nice for them to have a place to land. That's why I like there being some wiggle room here. These charts are not an exact match, but it's close enough that it feels accurate now. But now, here's where I'd like to share some new data with you. This chart of the user-reported brackets was, of course, based off of the ways that users understood the system back from the original announcement and the original list of 40 game changers. But it's possible that with the new expanded list of game changers, users will understand that system differently now, and therefore change what they report, right? Update this list from a 3 to a 4, or I've changed my mind on that list, I'm going to scale it back to a bracket 2 deck after all. I know I personally have some decks that I've been tweaking with now that I have a better understanding of the bracket system and the expectations that come with those decks. Ergo, the responsible thing to do here is to run that user-declared bracket report again. Get a fresh set of numbers based off of user reports now that the game changer list is bigger, and compare that to our data set. And drumroll please, here was the old figure, and here's the new one. And well, they're nearly exactly the same still. Like barely 1% shifts at most. So all those positive things I said about the distributions lining up with players before, that still holds up. Players have not responded to this change by altering their bracket claims. Instead, the new Game Changers list is still more accurately reflecting the places where players most commonly would like for their decks to fall. And therefore, the list is more successful at providing clues to players who would like to take that same step and try adopting this system themselves. Going back to that question at the top of this video, was this a good move or did the changes go too far? When I look at these figures, it signals to me that this move was a very, very good one. I feel like this truly justifies the expansion of the list, that we've broadly landed in the right neighborhood that we all need to be in. And I hope that further tweaks to the system take these numbers into account and resort more to fine-tuning than to broad changes. For instance, adding another 20 cards to the Game Changer list could end up swinging the pendulum too far in the other direction, could be an overcorrection. So I would urge that future expansions of the Game Changer list be much more moderate and much more on the level of tinkering. I'd also urge now that the Game Changer threshold of up to 3 at bracket 3 feels perfect here, given these numbers. I and many of you out there have probably seen many other creators hypothesize about whether the Game Changer threshold could change, go up from 3 Game Changers to 4 or 5 now that the list has expanded, and what that type of world might look like. An interesting thought experiment for sure, but for my part, given the numbers that I'm showing you here today, I would strongly urge not to change that threshold. To do so would, in my opinion, send us back to the type of discrepancy that we saw with the original set of graphs, which I don't think is as helpful to players. I expect this largely comes down to the size of the population that each of us individually feels is operating at bracket 3 or 4, even without any Game Changers in their decks, because obviously the presence of Game Changers in your decks is not the only thing that can declare it to a specific bracket. As I said before, I think the 41% figure we saw leaves a good amount of wiggle room to address that reality, but I think the 52% figure was too large of a gap. The 40 Game Changers list led to a substantial number of players feeling as though they had to report upward, and not just at bracket 3, but at bracket 4 too. But now, with the expanded list of Game Changers, each of those brackets feels more properly represented. Now, of course, there comes the possible counterpoint, the idea, are players the ones doing this wrong? Are players bracketing their decks upward because they misunderstand the brackets, and a lot more of decks out there are bracket 2s than those players think? Are they just defaulting to the middle because of some subconscious worry about their deck being a, quote, low tier? I'm inclined to say no. I don't read that from these results. Remember again that these are not results of automatic assignments, they are user specified, and I think user specifications do speak to intent. Declaring a deck as a bracket 3 is ultimately an acknowledgement that these players are game to play against the likes of Rift and Tithe and Study, and to hold their own against them even if they are not playing those cards themselves. Declaring one's own deck as a bracket 3 is a declaration from a player that they are not trying to play against decks that can't handle what they're serving. And if a player discovers that that is not the right spot for them after all, then perhaps they'll go back to their deck list and change things around. But across 2 reports now, even with the new info and new restrictions, these results have not really changed. So that also informs my evaluation of player intent here. I'm also inclined to say no because of that first graph, to assume that players might be misreporting their decks and that more decks out there are bracket 2 than people are self-reporting, has a knock-on effect to the way that we then have to evaluate bracket 4. I don't think that necessarily takes into account the way it squeezes the brackets 4 and 5 crowd. In fact, as we can see, even with the newly expanded Game Changer list, playing more than 3 Game Changers is kinda rare, but playing more than 5 Game Changers is barely scraping 12%, which, and this is anecdotal, but to me, if anything, I would hazard a guess that with more user data, we will find that the population of players playing at bracket 4 and 5 is larger than this current report can show us. The expanded list combined with the current threshold provide guidelines that feel, to me, more accurate to what players are doing and what players want. So that, philosophically, is where I'm coming from here, and why I think this new move was a really good one, and that the move now is to stay the course and to fine-tune, rather than to make any other big moves or structural changes. I'll leave off on one final thing here. A worry that my co-hosts have expressed a couple of times and that many community members have voiced too, is that the longer the Game Changer list ends up being, the harder it is to memorize. So then the more you end up feeling like you just have to treat the list of Game Changers like some some kind of checklist to just tell you what bracket your deck is supposed to be. Just like I can't figure it on my own because this list is way too long, so just plug my list into some site and have it spit out a number for me, you know? And again, Architect has an extremely sophisticated system for this, and I appreciate them very much for not only sharing data so that I can make videos like this in the first place, but also for reminding players in those evaluations that these are, of course, just estimates, and that your intent is what matters, because this can't just be science, it is both art and science. But yeah, I understand the overarching worry that if the list and the bracket system get too hard to wrap your head around them, then you just end up getting a little bit lost sorting out the particulars, which could then lead to a mindset among players of getting more focused on the letter of the law than on the spirit of the law. This video has, of course, focused a lot on the numbers of it all, which means I'm here running that same risk, potentially getting lost in the sauce or missing the forest for the trees. So to again reiterate, as I'm glad Gavin did in the update announcement, your intent is ultimately what matters here. Whether you're using this system or whether you're not, whether you're discussing the recent unbans with your regular playgroup or you're trying to find a game with strangers, the ultimate goal here is just to try and find a game that everyone is happy with, rather than winding up in a game where people don't get what they're after and it kind of feels like a crappy experience. How do I get a good game should be our North Star at all times. And with increased clarity of language, I hope we're getting closer to that, but it does still require some extra paying attention to, some extra cultivation to ensure that we don't lose sight of why this whole endeavor was started in the first place. And I know this last tidbit I'm about to share will end up being a little bit numbers-y again, but when I look back at that discrepancy that we saw in the initial data, at how many players were on their own declaring their decks above what the then list of game changers would imply their decks should be at, that's very heartening. That, to me, says that players seem to know what it is they're about, that they're less likely to try and angle shoot, and that more often we're likely to see players give an earnest attempt. And look also to the data that Gavin has shared in his article and his videos too, that at the event in Chicago, 87% of players who used this system reported to the surveys that they found it helpful. Now again, there's a bias amongst the data set here. When we look at the population that survey was done upon, that's a very engaged Magic player to go to a convention. But Wizards has been measuring other stats too, and we've seen some good adoption in other spaces for this new system. Dare I say, those signs also seem to point to some really good things. These observations are not the end-all be-all, but they do speak to player intention just a little bit, to the art that is also part of the science. And they appear to me to err on the positive. They speak of a player base that is excited, that is giving things a real college try, a player base that has just a little bit of scrappiness to it. To me, it says that the picture we're here painting together is shaping up to be a pretty stellar one. And that, I think, is a pretty good note to end on for now. Once again, make sure you hit those YouTube buttons so you don't miss our future videos going into even more depth about the hidden data of EDH and its player base. Let me know what other types of data dives you would like to see on the channel in the future too. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.